I don't like Final Fantasy VII, is something I've said for pretty much my entire adult and teenage life, but recently I had an epiphany to finally give it another shot. But maybe I'm getting ahead of myself. Why don't I give you a proper rundown of why I've felt this way for the last few years? See, in 1997, I did a thing that most young boys and girls were doing at the time, and was born. But that's when something else had the audacity of doing the exact same thing as me. The way I see it, it and I were destined to be rivals. I was naturally gifted with good looks, intelligence, and modesty, whilst Final Fantasy VII was gifted with something far more advantageous: popularity. Now, while I'd only just been born when Final Fantasy VII came out, both my brother and my neighbour were much older than me and were super into Final Fantasy and video games in general. And for as far back as I can remember, I used to sit and watch them play despite being only 3 or 4 years old. And I remember experiencing Final Fantasy in some shape or form throughout all of my childhood. Stuff like the opening to Final Fantasy X, its battle theme, the petrified forest in Final Fantasy IX, and this one very specific camera angle from Final Fantasy VII have all been very deeply seared into my mind. To really put into perspective how much Final Fantasy has influenced my small, tiny baby brain, my first ever teddy bear I actually named myself was called Overdrive. Looking back on it, I was destined to be a huge loser. One really funny part about all of this is, you know that guy from the hard drive article, world's biggest Final Fantasy fan, almost completed some of the games? Yeah, that's me. I've played an absolute shit ton of Final Fantasy games over my life, but I've only ever actually beaten 2 of them, and neither of them are mainline titles. Though, they're both pretty great. I should probably do a video on the 2 of them sometime. Of all the different FF games in the series, however, there's always been one that I've held in contempt, and that's Final Fantasy VII. For both a variety of valid and incredibly invalid petty reasons as well. To piss off as many of you as possible, I'm going to start with the ones that will probably make you click off of the video because I'm an idiot who refuses to pace or design his videos to keep people around. I think the biggest influence has always probably been between my older brother and the joys of experiencing spin-off Cloud before I was able to appreciate the original game. Starting off with my brother, he did actually enjoy FF7 quite a bit, but I also think it's probably his least favourite out of the ones that he's played. And to this day, he still makes jokes like, "Oh, you were born the same year as Final Fantasy VII, weren't you? Just goes to show, 2 pieces of shit can come out in 1 year." Thanks, bro. Love you too. But yeah, I think that sort of jokey mocking has kind of rubbed off on me over the years, except I've internalized it as, yeah, FF7 does suck, doesn't it? The other thing, as I mentioned, is spin-off Cloud. You see, it was only somewhat recently, when the remake was drawing near, that I realised that my perception of Cloud as a protagonist is very different to the majority of people who've actually played the original. I was always under the impression that Cloud was this sort of stoic, kind of mopey emo boy, and he definitely has that in him, but it's just an aspect of his character that's dialed up to 11 in every single game and movie and everything else that he's appeared in since the original game. And growing up seeing him in like Kingdom Hearts, for example, even though he had this cool ass design and a bandaged up Buster Blade, I never really liked him all that much. This wouldn't be a huge problem, except for the fact that it clouded my view on the original whenever I started playing it once I got old enough to really appreciate JRPGs for the story. Due to the lack of voice acting or subtle enough animation to fully convey emotion, it leaves a lot to the player to interpret how characters are expressing themselves. And after having years being exposed to spin-off Cloud, it meant that every time I attempted to play Final Fantasy VII, I'd go in with this bias created from the version of the character I'd already seen, resulting in me reading all of his dialogue in such a way that I never really liked. This was never helped by the fact that Cloud, at this point in the game, hardly does himself any favours in trying to convince a first-time player otherwise, which I assume wouldn't be a problem for somebody who was playing the game for the first time in 1997, but when you're trying to jump in and play it in, let's say, 2009 with the extra material that's around, your view can get somewhat tainted. My final invalid and very, very petty reason for disliking FF7 is simply because everybody else liked it. And it created this constant feedback loop. Being the fan favourite meant that Final Fantasy VII is always going to get special treatment. It's the one that gets the most spin-offs and the one that gets the most cameos and sequels and is the one that's getting the remake. Whilst the games that I loved in the early years like FF9 or the games that I came to appreciate later like Final Fantasy V and XII with the Zodiac Age all kind of just got forgotten, and it always frustrated me so much. I don't want to be one of those people who goes, ew, popular thing bad, but I mean, to an extent that is exactly how I am, but that's more for the fact that I feel like we shouldn't be slaves to the zeitgeist, because there's so much cool and interesting stuff out there that people just won't give a shot because they've never heard of anybody recommending it before. Regardless, I wanted to kind of correct myself and let myself be a bit more open-minded. So over the last 2 years or so, between seeing the remake and thinking it looked cool and talking to friends about it, I decided I was willing to give the game one more fully open-minded, honest shot before writing it off completely. Since, while my overall opinion of the game was quite low, there was still a lot of cool stuff in there, and I wanted to enjoy it. The music's all pretty banging, the Turks are the coolest, most suave group of motherfuckers you will ever meet.
They're so fucking cool!
And I love the idea of Tifa meteor driving me through a tape. I mean, Zack's pretty cool.
Me? Gungaga.
So here we are, a few weeks later, I've beaten the game now, and I'm ready to subjugate you all to my thoughts. You may have noticed during this terribly paced 1,000 word intro that the game might look a little bit different to how you remember, and that's because I played it on PC and have modded it a fair amount. I know this is my first real full playthrough of the game, and some purists might say that I should probably just play it how it was intended, but I specifically went with a bunch of mods that I feel like improved upon stuff without really spoiling what gave the original game its identity. I will go into a bit more detail talking about these mods later on in the video, but this is meant to be a review or something like that, so I'll leave that until a bit later on. And one last little side note before I get started, this game is 23 years old at this point. I'm not going to tiptoe around the game's plot. I won't deep dive right into the game's major events or anything that could undeniably be called spoilers, at least without giving a warning and a timestamp to skip to get past that point. But if you've only played part 1 of the remake so far and you've not touched Final Fantasy VII in any way other than that, then be warned that there will be light spoilers throughout all of this. So yeah, you've been warned. Now, what's a better way to start things off than with, well, the start? And honestly, I think FF7's first impressions are incredibly well done and constructed. Square really wanted to hit the ground running with this opening bit, especially since it's their first 3D Final Fantasy and all, and it's very clear how much effort and love was put into this opening sequence. While I'm not personally a huge fan of the diesel punk aesthetic that FF7 has, I can't deny that the city of Midgar perfectly captures that look, and the camera that follows Aerith out of the alleyway pans up and zooms out, showing you the full scope of the city before showing you a logo, and then zooming back into a different part of the city to show the train pulling into the Shinra reactor. That is all just one complete shot, barring a few close-ups of the speeding train before cutting back to the original camera position. And after all of that, it smoothly transitions into gameplay, and with just a few lines, you're playing the game. Now, I love long build-ups at the start of JRPGs. Kingdom Hearts 2 and Persona 4 are both some of my favourite games ever, and they both start with really long openings. And I really feel like it lets you marinate and really immerse yourself in the world. But I also think there's something equally commendable about jumping right into the action with barely a word. I feel like Square did everything they could probably think of to make this opening 3 minutes really show how different everything's going to be compared to the previous generation of consoles. And there's this very cheeky little symbolic Easter egg that shows this as well, with Cloud going from level 6 to 7 after the first battle, showing how the series is leveling up as well. The rest of the bombing run mission plays out really well too, with everything moving at a very brisk pace in such a way that allows for small exchanges between Cloud and Avalanche, as well as battles to be peppered throughout, to keep people with short attention spans completely engaged the whole time, while also feeding exposition to the player in short bursts. By the time you get to and finish the Scorpion Tank boss fight, you've probably seen magic as well as a limit break or two, as well as watch Cloud have his first mild freakout, this moment being important as it's the first seed of mystery planted in the story. As a whole, this entire section is a really nice vertical slice of the entire game, as it gives you just a little bit of everything. And this level of quality is pretty much maintained for the entire Midgar section. The various parts like Cloud awakening to new hobbies, the assault on the Shinra building, the Turks.
Jesus Christ, why are they so fucking cool?
They're all very memorable, and the G-Bike sequence at the end, capping it all off, is such a cool fucking minigame, even if the F&B before it looks really weird. I mean, just look at those noodle arms. It's honestly a bit of a shame that this section is incredibly short, especially considering they made a full game out of this when it's really just a 5 to 6 hour chapter of the original. It honestly surprised me how brief this section was when I was playing it this time round, and after thinking about it, it's not the weirdest thing, I get it. Like, at the time for Final Fantasy and JRPGs in general, having big open world maps with fairly small towns and dungeons was kind of how it was done. So Midgar was actually very big compared to what everybody else was doing at the time, and it's only really in retrospect when you think about how big an actual city would be that it starts to feel kinda small. Which is why in retrospect I can see why Square took this section and just turned it into its own entire game, since there was definitely a lot more that they could do with it. The original wanted me to care for the likes of Biggs, Wedge and Jesse, but they don't really have much screen time at all. Like, I'm pretty sure Biggs has less than 20 lines of mandatory dialogue. And yet, I'm struggling to care about him and the others when Shinra drops a plate on Sector 7, especially when I'm being blindsided by how cool the Turks are.
Oh god, I love the Turks so fucking much!
But yeah, I say that it's a shame that it's so short, because I feel like shortly after leaving Midgar, my enjoyment begins an admittedly slow decline, but a decline nonetheless. Each major story event, I feel, gets progressively a little bit less interesting to me as time goes on. The flashback sequence where Cloud catches everyone up to speed on who the hell Sephiroth really is really good. Fort Condor doesn't exist, and the infiltration of Upper Junon and the boat section is pretty cool outside of the awful marching section. But then, as this goes on, I feel like a formula kind of starts to set in, where we show up, Shinra or Sephiroth is around, we fight them, one of us runs away, and then the other ones give chase. And while I do find it hilarious when Sephiroth just pelts Cloud with a piece of materia or monster limb as he T-poses away, I get the impression I'm not supposed to think that. Granted, I do still like some of these sections. There's some good moments in here, especially when discovering Barret and Red 13's origins, and it's also the period in the game where we start to see Cloud's too cool asshole persona kind of shed away from him a little bit here and there. And we do get some interesting questions crop up when visiting certain places like Nibelheim and Gongaga.
Gongaga!
But despite that, I really felt myself struggling to find the motivation to keep going in these sections. And looking back on it, it's usually around about this point I would usually find myself dropping the game when I tried to play it the other times too. But at the end of the day, maybe I'm just being a little bit too harsh on it. I mean, this is the point in the game where I have to visit the Gold Saucer, also known as Hell on Earth, 2 separate times, and God, I hate this place. I hate it so fucking much. In all seriousness though, I don't think this is just it. The materia system, while pretty good, it's at this point where I think it's also at its weakest. Just due to the pacing, you get new types of materia and the speed that they level up during this point. In Midgar, you're fairly limited to what you have and what you can use. It's the early game, and this is when it's trying to ease you into it via tutorials, and this is completely understandable. But with very few options, it means that you have to develop niches for each character to fill. At least until you realise that everything in Midgar is weak to Thunder magic, so you just whack Thunder and Cure on just every party member and call it a day. Throughout Midgar and slightly beyond though, your materia, while it's limited, always has something new popping up and becoming part of your arsenal, which gives you some nice steady progress to customise your character builds as you go. This suddenly comes to a halt for a good while until around about the end of Disc 1, where for most of the time in this section of the game, The only new materia you're getting is summon materia, and while this provides some really cool summon animations, they're still basically just better versions of your normal attack magic, which means that most of the time in Disc 1, I just sat there with the same 4 or so materia on each character slots, and just filled the rest out with whatever bullshit I found along the way. Also, enemy skill is just way too powerful for its own good. Immediately upon leaving Midgar, you can get Matra magic for it, which will carry you through just about every single random battle for an instant win button until you can get Aqua Breath, which will do the same until you can get Magic Breath, which would carry you even further if it wasn't for the fact that at that point you can have Bahamut paired up with MP Absorb, which is way more efficient. There's also stuff like Mighty Guard, which casts Barrier, Magic Barrier, and Haste on the entire party for barely any MP, and it's busted as fuck. I mean, it pretty much invalidates Time and Barrier materias, barring a few of their later skills. It's not a huge problem, but I definitely spent most of this part of the game just spamming instant win spells, which I just got naturally as I was playing. I still had fun just demolishing shit, but I don't know, I play a lot of RPGs and I do like to get challenged by them. This does get solved to an extent in Discs 2 and 3, as materia does get a lot more involved at that point, and I do like it a good deal after that. Any system that allows you to break the game in some fun, crazy ways, I absolutely adore, and it's one of the reasons why I love the job system so much in other Final Fantasies. The only problems I do have with it is the stuff I just mentioned with the progression in Disc 1, and how certain combinations feel like they're so good that they kind of just invalidate everything else. Most of the time, just having a bunch of mimic plus counter material or something is gonna work no matter what you do. That being said, it does mean that the game rewards any form of experimentation, so I did enjoy giving Cloud long range, counter, and protect quartz and just whacking him on the back row for that bonus defense and turning him into the team's tank. There is some really interesting stuff when you do get invented with it, it's just that the game never really calls for you to do so, with the exception of Ruby and Emerald weapon at least. I was also going to make a comment about how I'm not overly fond of how the nature of the materia system kind of takes the uniqueness out of characters, since when everybody's customizable to the same extent, they all kind of feel the same, but thinking about it, this is something that's present in a lot of Final Fantasy games. It's probably a gameplay choice, and honestly, its personalization to individual characters is pretty equal to that of like Final Fantasy X and the original version of 12. The only difference being is that you don't have to commit as much, so experimentation is encouraged. Something else that was a slight but constant annoyance was the menus, which for the time I think were pretty decent, since JRPG UI design on the PS1 had a tendency for not being great. And Final Fantasy VII isn't too bad in that regard, but something that I always found bothersome is how items never auto-sorted, and how materia just gets left in the menu wherever you put it. As far as I could tell, there's no way to change this, and I'd spend a lot of time looking for very specific materia. In some cases, having like 10 plus empty slots in the middle of the list and not realizing that I had a bunch more materia below it. And another thing that is, again, not a huge deal, but just a little inconvenient, is the fact that you can't change gear and materia on inactive party members, which would make everything just a little bit too more clunky than it needed to be for my liking. This is all just quality of life things, and it's definitely cumbersome and a tad annoying, but it's not a huge problem, and I'm sure it's probably one of those things that the remake has fixed. Now, to sandwich those last few negative points with stuff that I did like, what really stood out to me especially was Disc 2. The game goes back to progressing at a similar rate to the Midgar section at the beginning, and we kind of move away from that repeating formula that I was talking about. Well, sorta. There is a bit where you have to go out and collect some magical MacGuffins for story reasons, but boy does this section just come and go really quickly, especially when you remember that Fort Condor doesn't exist, and you purposely fail the minigame so you only spend 5 minutes fighting a super weak boss instead of spending 30 minutes and a shit ton of gil on a really bad RTS. God, I really hope the version of this in Intergrade is better. And all of this is actually just one of 2 plot threads that are going on at this point. And getting back to that A plot is a really good motivator for this section of the game. What I really like about Disc 2, however, is that it's at this point in the game where we finally get to see a 100% genuine Cloud, and he's such a breath of fresh air. A lot of it is really minor things, like him giving Yuffie a pep talk and advice about how to deal with motion sickness aboard the Highwind, and he goes on about how he used to despise sitting in the back of Shinra trucks on missions. This is reinforced later on when he makes himself follow his own advice by piloting the submarine instead of letting Sid do it. Not because he's trying to be cool, not because he thinks he's the best person for the job, it's just that he wants to solely focus on taking his mind off what's going on, and he doesn't want to feel ill. This transformation on his personality honestly completely turns me around on the character. It's just unfortunate that this happens so late in the game because I had to endure a protagonist that I didn't like for about 30 hours to get to this. I think the best analogy that I can probably come up with to describe how I feel about this change is like the difference with Jotaro from part 3 to 4 in JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. The script and the camera start off really trying hard to make me like the character, going, yo, look at how cool and stoic this asshole is, isn't he cool? And then later on this changes to, yeah, so the cool badass is actually a huge fucking loser who tells bad jokes and likes dolphins or something, I don't know. This different perspective on the characters I feel really humanizes them and makes them so much more endearing. Speaking of the characters and the story, that's something I've not really talked about yet other than Cloud, so let's segue into that. The party has a pretty colourful and fun lineup, I feel. We've got edgy vampires, we've got the furry dick convention, we've got A. Pierre, and we've got an implied wife abuser. Oh wait, hold up. It's not his wife, never mind, it's totally okay now? There's nobody in the cast that I'd really consider a total stinker. Well, besides A. Pierre, but even he gets a decent moment or two. I don't want to go into too much detail breaking the characters down, since at the end of the day, if you're watching this, you either already know who they are, or you're looking forward to seeing them in the remake. So I'll leave some of the things I do want to say for the spoiler section coming up. One thing I really wish they'd done is just to have the whole group with you at all times, and only have the active party fighting. It's a very small problem, but there's just little bits of pieces that you'll probably miss. However, this isn't the case for all of them, as some of them are actually pretty big and important, and if you don't bring the right party members to certain areas, there's conversations that you can just completely miss out on. For example, if you go to Gongaga and speak to a certain person without Tifa and Aerith, that conversation means so much less. However, having the entire party with you for these parts would just mean that nobody would be able to miss out on anything important. This gripe might just be something that's a bit exclusive to me though, as I was really determined to have Tifa and the edgy vampire Vincent Valentine in my party at all times, and while Tifa usually has a lot to say in cutscenes, Vincent just doesn't. As much as I love just about everything about him, he's the one character that I think feels kinda half-baked compared to everyone else. Even compared to Yuffie, the other optional character. She at least has 2 side quests tied to her, meanwhile Vincent's equivalent is one very short conversation. I had him in my party pretty much constantly from the moment I could, and he only has one thing to say for a scene with Hojo. But other than that, he barely ever talks. He doesn't really even interact with the Turks in any shape or form, which would have made a lot of sense if he did. But, I mean, at least he has his own spin-off game to himself, which is totally still canon, praise be Square Enix. Okay, I'm gonna go into a few things that are within the realm of spoiler territory, so here's your heads up and a timestamp if you want to avoid that. I'm also just really fond of how they handled Rufus Shinra and Sephiroth throughout the story as antagonists. I'm honestly really surprised at how much of the game treats Sephiroth like a force rather than a character, which, considering the Sephiroth that you're dealing with for the majority of the game is not actually Sephiroth and one of Hojo's created clones being controlled by Genova, or Sephiroth, one of the two, it doesn't matter. It makes sense that that's how he's treated. You always see all of these things that Sephiroth is capable of throughout the game without actually dealing with him directly as a person. It's a really nice example of show and don't tell, and while it's not a horror game, Sephi definitely borrows aspects from what makes a really good monster or villain within a horror film. As the less you interact with them, the more your imagination has to start filling in the blanks, giving them this very foreboding sense to their character. Even when you do eventually encounter the real Sephiroth, he barely speaks a word, and the most info you ever get out of him is during the Nibelheim flashback. And even back then, while he's not the ungodly force you fight at the end of the game, he's still a huge badass compared to everyone else. Rufus Shinra, on the other hand, lets you wrestle with an actual person and have a bit of a back and forth with over the course of the game. I simply adore how his introduction is basically, "My father was a corporate slave, just as those below him were, but I assure you there's no need to worry, I am nothing like him. I simply don't care about this company or its reputation. I will rip every last scrap of money and power from the people, whether or not they're happy about it means nothing to me." He's one of those characters that I just can't help but love how much I hate him. Even when the planet is on the brink of destruction, the possibility of teaming up with you since your goals align does not cross his mind even once. Nope, his mind goes straight to public execution because even with his back up against the wall, the self-absorbed prick is still only thinking about himself. Also, I mean, he has the Turks, the coolest people on the planet under his command. Between them all, they have unbelievable levels of drip. And remember, the difference between being evil and morally grey is being attractive, so while we're still in the spoiler section, just one other thing I want to talk about is the reunion and Cloud falling into the livestream. Since I honestly think that these days, that's more of a spoiler than Aerith being shish kebabbed. After all, that's one of gaming's worst kept secrets, so I've heard people over the years mention Cloud falling into the livestream, but I never really knew what it was in detail. The whole section with Sephiroth making Cloud doubt who he really is something I think was done really well, since even I was questioning stuff, and I know about Advent Children and Crisis Core. Like, I know that Cloud exists before and after the story of FF7, but even so, I was still questioning things. There was actually part of me that was hoping that Cloud was in fact a real clone of Sephiroth, and the game could have this message where it doesn't matter if Cloud is a clone of Sephiroth, or if he's even the real Cloud. At the end of the day, his actions that he's going to take are what matters. There was a brief moment where it felt like the story was going to go in that direction for a bit, and I was really hoping that it was just something that I'd completely missed over these years and was like a really big part of Final Fantasy, but unfortunately I have been spoiled on just about everything. Just a few other things that I couldn't really find a place to fit while retaining good segues. Something really insignificant that I like quite a lot is the number of times FF7 tries to throw in some sort of weird gameplay gimmick or set piece, even if not all of them are winners. I mentioned the G-Bike section as it's probably the best and most extreme example, and it also caps off the end of the Midgar section. But things like the Chocobo races, the submarine section, and the snowboarding minigame are also really great. Even the less good examples like the Shinra stealth section, or watching Cloud struggle to push a button in sync with the rest of the party, or his pathetic excuse at CPR, were all these little gameplay palette cleansers that I thought, while they sucked, I still enjoyed them anyway, and they helped keep everything fresh. There are also a few things in the game, however, that I really feel like they're just designed to waste your time. I've mentioned Fort Condor already, as it really is the most miserable slow-moving RTS that I've ever played, and the fact that you have to pay in your own guild to actually utilise it means that you also have to do a ton of grinding in the world map if you don't do too well in a mission. Add on top of this that the rewards all kinda suck, like, sure, 2 unique weapons and an accessory are pretty good, and there's elixirs there, but most of the stuff you're getting is potions and ethers that you could buy from the shop for way less gil and way less time. The only real thing of value to grab there is the Phoenix materia, but that's something you do as part of the story anyway. And on top of that, you can do it much quicker by just not playing the RTS section. And this is something that applies to a whole bunch of things in the game, like pretty much everything in the Gold Saucer and Chocobo breeding, since all of the rewards that you can get for engaging with them can be acquired for much less time investment. The last thing I want to talk about before my closing thoughts is the mods that I was using. I know they're not really part of the core experience, but they were part of my personal experience, and normally I'd just make this a small footnote for the video, but I do have a fair few installed, and I figured a few people might be interested. This isn't a modding tutorial or anything, I'm just saying what I've got installed and what they do. Just as a heads up, because FF7 is so popular, everybody and their mums are trying to mod it, and because of that, it means that there's a bunch of different ways to actually modding the game. This results in a lot of mods not being compatible with each other, so if you want to get a bunch running at the same time, you might have to struggle a little bit. The go-to method that most people advise to use is the mod manager Seventh Heaven. It's a separate program that you can boot up, and it can easily download and install tons of different mods in a relatively simple way. It also has the ability to only install individual parts of mods, allowing you to mix and match between them freely. This is what I originally was using, but I ended up having to switch to a different method via the Reunion mod, as it featured a retranslation known as because, named after a spelling error in the original script. And unfortunately, as far as I could tell, there's no way to get because running with the Seventh Heaven mod manager. This meant that even though I'd spent a long time in Seventh Heaven toying around with it, I had to completely delete the game and re-download it so I could mod it from scratch with different versions of all the mods that I used. But what I was eventually able to get was something I was very happy with. There were 3 main mods that I use, and here's the rundown of what they all do. Reunion is actually a collection of different mods that include stuff like the retranslation that I mentioned before. But it also includes stuff like improved audio, 60 FPS battles, and some optional things like Weapon, which is a complete difficulty rebalancing of the game. I didn't use Weapon myself, and the things like the HD menus is something that I overwrote with other mods. The 60 FPS battles one has a few bugs with it, like the camera moving at a different speed to what it usually does when playing, but I still used it due to the PC port being a bit old and shitty, and the battles actually run at a lower frame rate than the PS1 version, which makes things like Tifa's limit slots a huge pain to use. There is also an option to have the battle animations either just normal or interpolated to be 60 frames per second as well, so if you're fond of the original frame rate but want to fix those battle menus, that's still possible. The second mod that I used is the Satsuki Yotoshi mod, specifically the 4.0 version. There is a 5.31 version at the time of this script, however the person making it is not making a version that works in tandem with Reunion, but luckily enough, somebody else converted one of the older releases so it did. The Satsuki Yotoshi mod is a HD overhaul across various aspects of the game. Menus, the world map, FMVs, the pre-rendered backgrounds, battle effects for spells, and much more have all been upscaled or redone, cleaning up a lot of the elements of the game's presentation. The pre-rendered backgrounds of which being the main highlight, as the pixelation has been wiped away and they look much cleaner. There's a very similar mod that I used originally when I was playing with Seventh Heaven, known as HD Remake. However, the person who was working on that had to drop the project due to life reasons, and it only covers the backgrounds. Finally, there's my personal favourite mod that I used, being the Nino-style character models. This one does 2 things. It replaces the chibi models that you use when exploring the pre-rendered backgrounds with slightly higher poly versions with much nicer textures to create these just nicer looking character models without losing the art style. As it currently stands, it's not 100% done, but all of the major characters have updated chibis, as well as about 70% of the NPCs. It was only around about Gold Saucer where I started to realise that certain NPCs weren't modded, and even then, due to the nature of how they look, they don't really stand out that much. The other thing it does is improve the battle models that your party members, as well as several bosses and human enemies, use throughout the game. What I like about this part is that the models themselves have barely been touched, so they retain that low poly look. However, the retexturing of the models is done in such a way that makes everybody resemble their original concept art. It really gives off this kind of impression that this is kind of the original vision that the art team might have had when they were making the game. What I really love about this mod is that while the difference is pretty big compared to the original models, the new ones still look incredibly faithful. It's very similar to how that Ever Crisis game seems to be handling things. And, at least to me, instead of feeling like they're just replacing the models, it kind of feels like an art restoration. It's also really nice seeing as this is the one mod at least I could find where the chibi models are given an equal amount of love, if not more than the battle models are. Since most mods that I've seen just replace the chibi models with the more proportioned battle models. The problem with this is that any NPCs that haven't been modded stand out like nobody's business, and also all of the animations in the field were never designed to accommodate realistic proportions, so Cloud will always just A-pose like a deer in headlights staring blankly at the screen, which is something that the Nino-style mods avoid completely. And with that final talk on mods, that just about wraps everything up. I know that I dragged into the game a bit, but I did have a lot of fun playing Final Fantasy VII. I just think it's good to find faults in the things that you enjoy. And also, I still think I prefer the likes of 5, 9, and 12. That, and all of the stuff that I mentioned, I think are all things that the remake is probably likely to improve upon, since that's kind of what remakes and reimaginings are for, after all. Needless to say, I do look forward to getting around to the remake as soon as, but before that, I still have a few other things I want to have a gander at. Maybe a few spin-offs centering around a memory, the Turks, a hero, and an edgy vampire. But who knows?